Hello, my name is Abby Brent. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the visual stimuli of Apis mellifera and how it informs flower recognition. The Western European honeybee, scientific name Apis mellifera, has up to 33 subspecies, including Apis mellifera ligustica and Apis mellifera carnica, which are the two most abundant subspecies in Texas. The honeybee is a eusocial insect that functions as a superorganism and is used as livestock to provide pollination services for crops and is also a source for honey. The honeybee is a valuable asset to our ecosystem as well as cultural services and is studied as a means to preserve and better understand their role in both. To support their pollination, the means of how honeybees forage must be looked into. One facet of foraging is honeybee vision, which is one of the stimuli by which bees navigate to flowers and collect pollen. The honeybee sees in trichromatic color vision, which allows for perception of color constancy, segregation of color, and brightness coding. The eye contains three types of photoreceptors that peak in the UV, green, and blue parts of the spectrum. Color patterns refer to the color differences in parts of the flower seen by bees. Flowers typically display petal colors with high contrast to their environment and contain a center that is easy to see within the flower against the bright petals themselves. This is called chromatic contrast. An example of what bee vision might look like is provided in Figure 1, which we can see is a much lower resolution than our own vision and is processed in more of a color space. In the middle graph, we can see bees' sensitivity curves to different wavelengths and their thresholds of spatial resolution of the chromatic and achromatic visual system in the far right. The question we will be investigating in this presentation is, what chromatic visual stimuli do honeybees rely on for flower recognition? This concept was researched in a study where researchers extracted and analyzed chromatic cues from color patterns of flowers as seen through the eyes of the honeybee, then tested how bees discriminate and recognize two-color concentric patterns in behavioral experiments. They did this by first training the bees to associate a reward, a sugar solution, with colored visual concentric patterns commonly found in flowers, maintaining color combinations against a gray background, and setting the stage for behavioral experiments. Apis mellifera's vision is lower in spatial resolution and higher in chromatic stimuli, which means color vision is usually the first use of visual stimuli when attempting flower recognition. To discriminate and find the reward, the bees use the flower's concentric color patterns, which describe as a distinct ring around the pistil and the surrounding edges of the petals. We can see this in Figure 1b, as the chromatic contrast between the center and surrounding edges of the flowers are well above the discrimination threshold. Reflecting this type of pattern would be common to see in wildflowers used for foraging. The edges of the flower's color pattern are especially important to the bee's foraging process, as a higher contrast color such as violet or blue against a typical foliage background containing a range of greens clues bees in to a potential resource that they can inspect. This experiment carries into Figure 2a, where after the bees begin to associate specific concentric color patterns picked by the researchers with the reward they would receive, they were then tested without a reward in 2b to see what they remember and what they chose when given more color options. The figure shows the choice frequency of their options with the characteristic reliance on high color contrast, both against the backgrounds and within the concentric patterns of the flower, but it began to vary between each bee as color contrast became less obvious and more varied. When this happened, bees would turn to spatial cues to inform their choices, which refers to the space, size, and placement of the color in the pattern. The pattern structure of the flower is shown to be taken into account in this experiment, as bees considered a bolder color in the center or surround and often relied on what they remembered from the reward training to discriminate and choose what they thought would yield resources. Figure 4 highlights how honeybees use these chromatic visual stimuli in their own experience to make decisions regarding flower recognition in familiar and novel patterns. The experiment in 4a included novel patterns of varying chromatic contrast, and newbies were rewarded for choosing one color in a pattern of 8 that covered a large area. This was done to test to see if they would learn the full pattern or focus on the dominant color, and to see how they would respond to novel patterns. When tested with novel patterns, they would choose the original pattern, showing they learned the entire pattern and did not simply rely on the color or spatial cues. When shown as single color options, bees still tended to prefer the color that covered the larger area of the original pattern, showing spatial cues are considered. This shows how bees use spatial cues, color patterns, and learned experience to inform their decisions, yet tend to prioritize color patterns when other stimuli are moot. This flexibility in flower recognition suggests that bees are able to prioritize certain chromatic stimuli over others, which can influence how they respond to both familiar, familiar and novel patterns in flowers. Using visual input such as color pattern recognition and spatial stimuli, honeybees are able to pair the stimuli with experience and flexible decision making, allowing them to pollinate and forage for resources efficiently. Though through the final experiment, it was also shown that Apis mellifera can choose between chromatic stimuli when discriminating for flower recognition based on the floral patterns they encounter. This research is significant because it shows that this use of color patterns, spatial stimuli, and experience shows that floral recognition in honeybees is both experience based and flexible, explaining bee behavior and foraging characteristics, giving beekeepers more insight into foraging patterns and traits. Bees being able to use different stimuli and their lived experience as their basis for flower recognition is also important to consider when discussing excuse me, when discussing changing environments due to climate change and the frequent change in diet and foraging resources for commercial bees as they are moved by companies to provide pollination services. This also gives some insight to how they might function through flower constancy to pollinate and forage. Thank you for your time, and here are my references.